Well, good morning, everybody. So my name's Stephen Lightfoot, and it's my very great privilege to welcome you all to the November 2020 virtual meeting of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency Board that's going to be held in public. As I said, my name is Stephen Lightfoot. I'm the chair of the board, and my role is to lead us through today's agenda and facilitate a good discussion on some really important topics that we've got on the agenda today. And they include the Chief Executive's report, a report on the most impactful scientific research projects that are being conducted across the agency, and I think that's a particularly interesting one. We've got an important report from our enforcement group on how we actually protect patient and also public safety from the integrity of the supply chain point of view. We've got an assurance report from our Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, and we're going to have a discussion on the strategic priorities for our next corporate plan. Now, we're using a different video conferencing technology to what we used last month, and that's for a very deliberate reason. We're looking to evaluate which one is providing the better experience, not only for the board, but more importantly for members of the public and our staff who are also able to watch this particular meeting. Now, I'm delighted that today's board meeting is going to be watched by 19 members of the public, including representatives from some 10 different patient organisations. And we've also got 26 members of our staff who are actually watching today as well. So welcome to each and every one of you. We'll also be recording the meeting so that we can publish the video on our website and our internal intranet site to allow even more people to see the work that the agency does. Now, for those of you who've not attended one of our board meetings before, I would just like to start by reminding everybody that this is a board meeting held in public, and it is not a public meeting. It's also important to state that this particular board is responsible for the strategic leadership of the agency and does not make regulatory decisions on individual products. Now, that's particularly important to point out because regulatory decisions are made completely independently by the appropriately qualified professionals within the agency who follow robust processes and are advised by expert committees. So it's really important we understand the role of this board compared to our regulatory processes. Now, as far as this particular meeting is concerned, then the board will discuss and agree any specific actions on each agenda item, and we'll do that first. And if there's time, my plan is to provide the opportunity for members of the public to ask questions on that particular agenda item before we do move on. In addition to that, and perhaps more importantly, I've also allowed 25 minutes at the end of the meeting for an open discussion so that members of the public can ask any question, certainly within reason anyway, so that we can obviously have that further debate that I think is very important in terms of this transparent discussion with the public. Now, for questions, our Director of Communications, Rachel Bosworth, will collate the most popular questions and read them out so we can cover as many topics as possible. So Rachel, can you just give us a wave so we all know who you are? That's up in the top corner. Now, from previous experience, there is a chance that we might not be able to answer every single question during the meeting. But as we did last time, we will commit to answer every question that we cannot address today by email within the next 2 weeks. Now, to help us do that, if audience members do want to raise a question, and you can do that on the software that's been provided, then please just add your name so that we can obviously potentially contact you after the meeting if that's necessary. Now, as far as introductions are concerned, I'd also like to introduce each of my board colleagues, if that's okay, and ask them, each of them to give a wave in turn so that the audience can see who we all are and what our respective roles are. So first of all, and most importantly, Dr. June Rain, our Chief Executive. Can you just give us a wave, June?
Morning, everyone.
So we've also got Dr. Sam Atkinson, our Chief Quality and Access Officer. We've got John Fundry, our Chief Operating Officer. We've got John Quinn, our Chief Technology Officer. And we've got Dr. Christian Schneider, who you'll be hearing later, our Chief Scientific Officer. And then we've also got our independent non-executive directors. So in alphabetical order, starting with Barbara, Dr. Barbara Bannister. We've got Mandy Calvert. We've got Professor Bruce Campbell.
Good morning.
We've got Mercy Jessingham. We have Anthony Rogers. We have Professor Liam Smeeth.
Morning.
We have Michael Whitehouse. And we have Professor David Webb.
Good morning.
I also owe David an apology for not publicly congratulating him at our last meeting on his award of a CBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours list in October. It was most remiss of me, David. It was absolutely not intentional. I should have mentioned it earlier, and I think we should just record our board's congratulations for this prestigious and very, very well-deserved honour. So well done, David. It's very well earned.
Thank you. That's very kind.
We're also joined today by a number of external people from the agency. So first of all, we've got Dr. Alistair Hardesty, Head of MHRA Sponsorship at the Department of Health. We've also got Elizabeth O'Neill from our Government Legal Department. Just give us a wave, Elizabeth. We have Kathy Harrison from Principal Pharmaceutical Officer in Northern Ireland is with us. We also have Professor Alison Strath from the Scottish Government as Interim Chief Pharmaceutical Officer. And I understand we'll also be joined later by Greg Chalmers from the Scottish Government too. And then last but by no means least, we've also got Natalie Richards, who's acting as our new board secretary, following the really good news that Aidan McIver is moving into a new role in the Operational Response Centre at the Department of Health and Social Care. Now, I think as probably also just worth saying that as Aidan's been our board secretary, for the last 9 years, I think we should just record our sincere thanks in the minutes for his unfailing readiness to offer help and advice to every single one of us over 9 years. And he's seen all the different chairs and all our different styles and idiosyncrasies. So I would certainly like to wish Aidan well with this new appointment. A really good opportunity for you, Aidan. So thank you for that. So that's the introductions over from my point of view. Have I missed anything, colleagues? I'm seeing lots of shaking of heads, so we'll take that as a no. So, okay, thank you for that. If we can then just move on into the board pack and just move, first of all, onto the agenda. I don't believe there are any apologies for absence, as I think everybody's here. So on that basis, could I ask if there are any new declarations of interest? Again, I'm not seeing any hands, so therefore we'll say there aren't. If we can then move on to the minutes, please, which is on page 3 of the board pack. First of all, can I just check if there are any questions or concerns of accuracy of the minutes from the last meeting? So it's on page 3 of the board pack. So again, I'm not seeing any hands raised. So can we therefore take those as a true record, Natalie? Thank you. Excellent. And that leads us then on to the action list. So that's on page number 8 of the board pack. So there's a couple of actions that were carried forward from a previous meeting. The first one is about presenting how device registries and the UDIs and device databases are being developed in the health system. I know, John, I've seen a draft paper that's obviously in preparation. When do you think that that overview will be ready?
It's been through the executive committee, but we've tested it with Bruce, and I think it's fair to say there's some amendments required. I think our target will be for the next board.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, I think that'll be helpful because it's really important we understand the wider context of how device registries are going to be developed across the health system in the UK. The item number 5 from a previous meeting was about arranging a board seminar to discuss how the MHRA can engage with patients more widely, a really important topic. Having sort of thought about this and discussed it with some colleagues, I think what I'd like to do is to actually test exactly what this seminar should involve with the new Patient and Safety Assurance Committee. So on the assumption that we actually agree the membership of that committee later today, I'd then like to actually have a discussion with that particular assurance committee first and then come back. But I certainly want to have this seminar before the end of January at the very latest. But I think it's sensible to involve our new Patient and Safety Assurance Committee in the process. In terms of item number 7, June, there was a request to provide an update on the Memorandum of Understanding with NICE. Is there any update on that you can provide?
The partnership arrangements are evolving and embedding, and I think it's worth waiting just till the beginning of December before we circulate this in the pack. But just to say, works well in hand, but it really is a matter of getting into the Memorandum of Understanding the facets of our new relationship that you will want to see.
Yeah, Excellent. Now, partnership working, particularly with NICE, is going to be very important to us. Item number 8 was arranging a board seminar discussion on diversity and inclusion, and the plan is to hold that in December. In terms of item number 9, Sam, there was a comment around exploring what can be communicated to patients on how and why the MHRA makes its decision on COVID vaccines. Can you give a brief update on that?
Yeah, of course, thank you. This is very much an area of active work at the moment. It's clearly incredibly important that we provide clear and independent information on both benefits and the risks of new products to the public. So this obviously has to be taken into account in relation to the robust and in-depth scientific evaluation that will be completed. So we're currently working closely with various partners across the system and various other government departments, so the likes of DHSC and PHE, to ensure clear and accurate communications and information will be available. So it's an ongoing piece of work, I would say, at this point in time.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say we understand the importance and also we're working with other partners in the health system to make sure that we can deliver that when decisions have been made, which obviously they have not yet. Okay. In terms of item number 10, that was around, again, patient involvement. So that will be picked up as part of the seminar with patient engagement. And we'll talk to the Patient and Safety Assurance Committee on that. Drawing up scenarios to stress test the governance framework was an action given to ARAC. That's the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee. And Michael's got a paper on that in this board pack. So we'll come back to that later. And then in terms of the membership, in terms of reference of the board assurance committees, the membership's in this board pack, and we'll discuss that later. So they were the formal actions. Was there any other matters arising from the minutes that have not yet been mentioned? Anthony?
Sorry, I actually haven't got a raised hand on Zoom, so I just wanted to check with June, just to make sure that we're still heading in that direction with NICE, that it is really about partnership, how we can support one another, not duplication in this memorandum, rather than the previous one, which was about this is our boundary.
Absolutely, you've put it very well. The need to have a really transformed MOU flows from what Antony has just said, that the former one was about defining our boundaries, whereas this one is about our synergies and our partnership arrangements, which will be in the very best interests of delivering products to patients. Thank you.
Okay, so were there any other matters arising? I'm not seeing any more shaking of heads, so let's sort of say we'll note those actions as described, and we'll move on to the first item on the agenda. So June, about the current context, what are the current key issues from your point of view?
Well, thank you. Clearly this report from all of us for November brings together, as you've said, the current areas of focus. And I hope it also, rather a long paper, sets the scene for some of the topics and discussions that will follow. I guess the first thing to say, it's absolutely clear from what you see in the report that it's a tremendously busy time for the agency, with a number of important priorities that are running concurrently, and that's a point to emphasise. But in terms of giving, if you like, some high-level messages to everyone before we open for discussion, our focus on healthcare access really does remain our key deliverable at this critical time. We've already touched on the intensive work on the COVID-19 vaccines, and that really has been a major area of effort. The readiness to operate at the end of the transition period, leaving the EU, to ensure that patients and the healthcare system throughout the UK have the medical devices and the medicines that are needed. And of course, the growing international collaboration to accelerate access to innovative products. And those are just 3 ways we're working intensively to make sure healthcare access is delivered. But second big message is that patient safety remains our priority in all our activities. We certainly haven't taken our eye off the ball in that regard, given the intensive work that everyone is aware of. There are examples in the report both of important benefit-harm casework that's been handled, but also of some strategic work, related communications to strengthen our safety system, such as the Med Safety Week, where we led a big campaign with a lot of other countries worldwide, some new to the piece, to renew attention on the importance of reporting adverse events. And my third big message, if you like, has to be, at this particular time, our staff, our key asset is our staff, we always say, but we particularly recognise at this time are central to our ability to deliver, both as an agency and for UK government. And I and the Executive Committee are only too aware of the pressures this creates, particularly as we went into the second lockdown earlier this month. We've got a new programme of work headed by our Diversity and Inclusion Lead, and it's my pleasure to say that Sam Atkinson has been appointed our Mental Health at Work champion. And that really gives a focal point and emphasises our commitment in this area. Our staff meetings are being held with increased frequency to ensure involvement and feeling of engagement, particularly as change is on the horizon. And I'd like to emphasise too that we celebrate success. Delighted that our clinical trials unit has reached the last stage of the Civil Service Awards, and that really is a tremendous achievement in the category of resilience and rapid response. And I would like to add our Chief Technology Officer, John Quinn, who's here, has been designated in the UK's top 100 of Chief Information Officers. So we celebrate all of these things while being only too acutely aware of the pressures that there are. So key messages: intense work at this moment on healthcare access, particularly in the space of the vaccines. Patient safety will always be our priority, and I hope that's evident every day. And our dynamic organisation, which continues to deliver for patients and for the public, really through the efforts and the sterling commitment of our staff. So I'll stop there. If you like, it's a high-level set of messages, but I hope at this tremendously busy time, you're aware of everything that's going on to deliver.
Okay, well, thank you, June. I think it does demonstrate very well just the huge breadth of activities that the agency is involved in, so thank you for that. So I think, David, you were first with your virtual hand, so can I come to you first?
Yeah, so well, I'd definitely like to endorse the very well-deserved congratulations to the Clinical Trials Unit on their nomination for a Civil Service Award. I think that's fantastic. And through my own activities with NIBS, I'm aware how far they've gone above and beyond their normal duties to help support work during the pandemic. I hope that the whole of the agency is doing a tremendous job. My question, June, is, and I'm not sure how much you'll be able to answer it, but it's a fairly straightforward question. I see you're starting to do virtual visits to international laboratories and drug manufacturers. And that sounds like a really interesting opportunity to cut costs, avoid waste of time. And I just wonder to what extent these will complement the face-to-face visits, and to what extent real visits are done without warning, which presumably is much more difficult when you're doing them virtually.
Well, I'm really glad that you've reinforced everything that has been great about our clinical trials unit and where they've reached in the Civil Service Awards. And I can't emphasise more, this is really prestigious. It's a very hot competition, and we've got our fingers crossed that they will prevail and actually get there, because they embody this rapid response and resilience. In your main question, you've highlighted something incredibly important for new ways of working, and this relates to the use of virtual tools and techniques that are not just simply to actually sort of engage with clients or customers or industry, but actually to see what's going on, using video, for example, to be able to get a handle on what was remote bioequivalence in faraway places like India. So it is a tool that will complement what we do in our more traditional boots on the ground, as we call it. And for cause inspections, my guess is it will always be a blend, that actually there needs to be a face-to-face. If I may, I'd like to hand over to Sam Atkinson at this point to give you a bit more of an insightful view, if that's okay, Stephen.
Yes,
Thank you so much. June's absolutely right. There is a blend that will be needed, and it really depends on the area of good practice that we're talking about as well. Some are far easier to do by remote inspections and using the digital technology that's available. But when it comes to unannounced, there is a real benefit to actually be on site with the unannounced, because very much with digital and virtual inspections or visits, they do require an element of, I guess, working with the organisation and the host, and of course unannounced are not necessarily welcome visits, so they can be slightly more challenging. So we still are doing unannounced visits. Indeed, we're still doing visits even through this lockdown, and we do have risk assessments and approaches to do that, and we are undertaking normal, I say normal inspections in terms of boots on grounds, but also unannounced that are relevant to COVID or critical inspections. So we can blend it, and I think there's real opportunity to use this digital technology going forwards in our inspection plans.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that. Mercy, I think you were next.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm really glad we have a mental health at work champion, so that's really good news. But my main question is really about these hand sanitizers and the warnings. I want to know how much publicity has been given to it so that the public is aware of it. And do we know, has this gone into care homes? Has it gone into hospitals? Because obviously it's quite concerning that people think they're protected and they're not.
Well, thank you, Mercy. That's highlighted an area of current intense work. And as you can see from the numbers in my report, there really is a buoyant activity out there, and absolutely a critical need for the information that we provide, and the, if you like, level playing field makes absolutely clear that companies can't go beyond what data show in terms of COVID-19 related issues, which is at the moment very much restricted. So we've done some urgent notices. As you can see, we investigate complaints, but I think the point about how much more can we do to promulgate the best advice, that's one that I think we would like to think a bit more about. I think we've done a certain amount, but I think probably you're highlighting the care home sector where even more could be done to target that information.
Excellent. Okay, Michael, I think you were next. Can you come off mute, Michael, please?
Yeah, thank you. My question, June, relates to EU exit, and I'm impressed by the web seminars that you've organised and the attendance. I suppose my question is really, are we confident that as best as we can as the regulator, we have responded to uncertainty that the industry may have, and that we are as well prepared as we can be?
Thank you for that. This is a matter of huge importance to us, and clearly colleagues will be aware that negotiations are still underway, but our commitment is to inform as speedily as possible all the information that we have. As you say, the focus on the first set of post-transition guidance with the webinars and the massive attendance has been very rewarding, and we're following up with repeat runs and new areas that come to light from the questions that we hear in the first round. So the question you've asked is, are we confident? We are as prepared as we can be, but we're on the front foot to bottom out any final aspects that need to be communicated and engaged with specific sectors. In parallel, we're doing a lot of work on dry runs. We had a very helpful and, shall we say, quite heavy touch audit that gave us a lot of insight into the readiness and the actual demonstration to ourselves that processes and procedures are in place. So still very much on the front foot, but as prepared as we can be, given the imperative of getting medicines and medical devices out there to patients and the healthcare service without any blip or interruption.
Thank you.
I think in addition to that, actually, June, if I may, certainly that's very much the internal assurance perspective. There's a lot of external assurance going on as well, Michael. So, you know, we have a monthly meeting with the Minister, There's regular meetings with the Department of Health. We know that there are very regular touch points with industry and various other stakeholder groups. So there's a huge amount of work going on within the policy division and the communications division and engagement, both up and across and down the line. So, I think this is a very, very serious piece of activity that, the team are really pulling the stops out on. So I feel from what I've seen, on a day-to-day basis that, all the preparations have been made as best that we can within the framework that we're having to operate within, as June says.
Thank you.
Okay, Mandy, I think you were the next.
Thank you, Stephen. My question was really around back to the vaccine in COVID-19. You mentioned quite a lot about the independent surveillance post-approval of both vaccines and testing. What resources and powers does the agency have or need to undertake that independent surveillance? And are we assured that they're adequate?
Well, thank you. This is really, really important. And I would like to first say that we start from a position of huge preparedness. The work began some time ago on the various tools and methodologies and resources that were needed, right down to our IT support to capture and manage data. So we're pressing ahead and as prepared as we can, both scientifically and in resource, IT and human. We will of course be working not alone in this, but in collaboration with Public Health England and indeed with various academic bodies who are very able to give independence in terms of their surveillance methodologies. So we've got a blend of various activities and ready to roll. And just this week, we'll be inviting members of the public through our app to start preparedness as and when we have the vaccines to get involved. So a number of tools and approaches. You also mentioned batch testing, and that's a matter where we need to be assured that the products going out there are of high standards of quality and effectiveness and potency that NIBS colleagues are at the ready too. So if I might just through you, Stephen, ask Christian to say a word about that.
Yeah, please do, Christian.
Thank you, indeed. So pharmacovigilance and batch vigilance are the two sides of making sure that vaccines are safe for use. So the quality of a vaccine is very much translating into safety as well. So by having that independent testing program in place at the time when needed, I think we will add quite a bit of resilience, a lot of resilience into this. And the NIBSC has been working on this with a lot of priority and pressure, obviously, to get this in place. So we are confident that we can also release the batches of vaccines once needed.
Excellent. Okay, I think Anthony, we might have lost her. I know Anthony had a question, but are you online, Anthony? No, obviously not. Okay, were there any other points for June at this particular stage? Okay, I think not. Okay, that being the case then, Rachel, can I just check that there are any questions? I don't believe there are any questions from the public yet.
There aren't at this point.
Okay, can I just ask our communications colleagues behind the scenes just to make sure members of the public know how to ask questions using the Slido functionality, if that's possible, please? That would be great. Okay, that being the case then, can we then move, thank you June, thank you very much for that comprehensive report. If we can move on to the area of healthcare access, and in particular, the area of scientific research, and the agency does a huge amount of varied and very complex scientific research. I've specifically wanted Christian to prepare and present this paper because, I think there's a huge amount of energy, innovation, and really exciting work that's going on. And Christian has the impossible job of trying to summarise all that into one short paper, and even more impossibly then to try and summarise what are the 3 or 4 key messages that you'd like to bring out from this paper, because you can assume that we've read it, Christian. So over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for members to digesting this paper, which is not a short paper, and I apologize for this, but you may have spotted that the research and innovation portfolio at the agency is quite big, And this is actually a nice problem to have, obviously, because we are serving a number of different areas. And what I would like the board to do is to identify areas which should be considered for the agency's portfolio, which may not be represented or maybe should get more emphasis, and also to comment on the proposal to bundle this into more governance, not hard governance, I would say, but to combine and prioritize oversight in a more defined organizational structure, or maybe a valid structure, not so much as a structure, as a committee, but a Center for Regulatory Science. And what I would like to highlight is that some of the areas that are highlighted in this are very exciting, because they cover cross-agency work, like, for example, for genomics and diagnostics. We've had quite a bit of interactions now as part of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also before, between different divisions, like devices, for example, for in vitro diagnostics, and with NRBSC, and also for the Regulatory Center on Genomics, and with NRBSC when it comes to next generation sequencing and genomics. So that is only one area. The other take-home message is that very likely, based on the pandemic, we will have to feature re-emerging pathogens or emerging pathogens more prominently in the future science strategy, including how to handle from a regulatory and scientific perspective a situation where current pathogens might mutate over time. So the coronavirus, for example, and we have years of experience how to handle this from influenza, because influenza is, as we know, in its nature all the time, changing all the time. This is why we have a new vaccine every year for each season. So this would not be a new threat, so to speak. We would be able to handle this, but to work out scientific concepts and regulatory concepts for that, I think could be one of the areas, and should be one of the areas that we might want to look at. And maybe I close here, Chair, and invite any questions or comments.
Okay, just before we do that, could I just ask a question? Could you just maybe describe the Centre for Regulatory Science that you've got in mind, just to put a little bit more meat on the bones of what that potentially, that oversight role could look like in practical terms?
Of course, thank you. So this is obviously something which would have to be discussed more in depth, how it should look like. But what I'm envisaging is that there could be a few people, a few scientists, who could basically combine areas like input from the Innovation Office, horizon scanning, and all the academic relationships that we have. There is currently a group which could be consulted on this, where we have academic relationships, which of course are very important. I did not put them into this paper because there's so many of them. At least NRBSC has pages and pages of different interactions when you put that into a document. But to bundle all of this and to identify if there are any synergies, for example, that we have some sort of internal intelligence of what relationships we have, I think would be very important. And I could imagine that this could be a very small resource, but powerful to that end, that it would enable to identify these synergies, and also to help scientists across the agency to find out if their particular research interest is strategically aligned to the agency science strategy and focus areas.
Okay, welcome back, Anthony. I think we lost you from the last meeting, so we've had to move on, I'm afraid. I'll come to you in a moment, but Professor Bruce Campbell, I think you had your hand up first.
Look, thank you. I mean, I think from my own personal perspective, this is one of the most exciting papers to come to the board since I've been a board member, because I think it's an opportunity that the MHRA has been missing for years. And I think, the idea of a centre with a few people, I could actually see a subsection of the agency, which is an institute for regulatory science. This is an area which is hugely lacking in the UK. I've actually had an approach from one major university that's thinking of setting up a centre like this. And so I think as a concept, I think this could be huge. And I think it's an empty hole that needs to be filled. I think that what I note about the paper, not unexpectedly, it's about NIBSCI, and CPRD, because they both have huge academic and scientific bibliographies, track records, but I think there's much more that the agency isn't doing, and the chairman knows, because I've had conversations with him about, for example, all the plans for patient engagement. You know, this is part of developing regulatory science. And I've put it to the chairman, and we'll discuss this perhaps later in the day, that, you know, if we're going to start expanding patient engagement, we should be doing this in a thoughtful way, in a way that we audit, in a way that we say, how is this helping? What is its benefit? And publishing that. That is regulatory science. And there are other huge areas, just before I stop, that there are things like, you know, the yellow cards. I mean, there's huge amount of information, but the yellow cards, how are they helping? How can we do them better? And there are so many parts of the agency's activity, even, for example, developing new ways of dealing with devices after Brexit. That is regulatory science. And just to do it without recording what you're doing in a scientific way and then publishing it, and that always makes you think. And it makes you think how you could do it better. So that's just some of my take on this, which I think is very exciting. And I think we ought to think much more broadly than what the agency has done up to now, good though that is.
You've got a great fun there, Christian. Do you want to respond to that?
If I may, you see me smiling a lot, Bruce, on this, because indeed this is an integral part of this paper, because colleagues have already published quite a number of regulatory science pieces in internationally highly regarded journals. Very recently, for example, on orphan medicines or on biosimilars and the need for clinical trials, which also have found their way already in a draft guideline, which is for public consultation. I think that this is exactly what regulatory science should do. It should expand and explore and evolve the frameworks that we have, if they are still fit for purpose or if we can do them better. And if they then go into a guideline, that is even better. And I should say that the paper is very NIPSCI, because obviously I was asked to also put the NIPS focus areas in them. Since NIPS is a research organization as well as what it does, of course the paper reads very NIPSCI, but to be very clear, that the regulatory science that you have just mentioned, I think is a key part of this. And I think it must be expanded exactly in the way that you have described it. So thank you for your support in this.
That's great. Okay, David, I think you wanted to come in on the same conversation.
Yes. Well, I'll start in the same place as Bruce, and then I'll move on. And I'm afraid I've got about 4 points I wanted to raise, some of which can't be answered, but I'd like to kind of get them into the public domain.
Okay.
So, first of all, I mean, I really like this paper. Of course, we need regulatory science. Of course, we already have regulatory science, but we need more coordinated regulatory science. I mean, it is important to mention that the FDA has a Centre for Regulatory Science and that the EMA has a coordinated group for regulatory science. MHRA needs to think about where it would sit with all of that. Of course, FDA also has academic regulatory centres, relatively small number, but they're centres that support academically the work that their agency does. And I would support the idea that we need to reach out to groups that have enough critical mass to make real support. What I missed in the paper was, no, I didn't miss it, but we need to think very hard about what our particular strengths are, which we want to build on, that perhaps others don't have. What might be the highlights of UK regulatory science. And also, I think we need to think about, perhaps not in this paper, what the weaknesses are and how we address them. So I think there's another paper needed at some point that takes some of this on. My other 3 points are all relatively small. I still have a concern personally about turning real world data into real world evidence. It looks quite easy to do here. It's not at all easy. Biases cause all sorts of problems. Liam may want to comment on that or not, but I think that's just looks too easy the way it's written at the moment. However, I think CPRD has a fantastic role to play in recruitment for trials and for undertaking pragmatic trials. I think that will be really important. And the weakness we have still is secondary care data. I'm not sure we're going to sort that out in the near-term future, but as we have electronic health records moving into the hospital system, maybe that's even a possibility over time. So that was my second point.
David, can we maybe just follow your second point through? I will come back to you for your third point. Yeah, Liam, just coming back to the point on real-world data to real-world evidence, have you got a perspective around that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make, because clearly we are increasingly kind of engulfed by real-world data.
Yeah.
And really, I think that it's often confused. I mean, often the terms, the fact that the data exists is often taken almost as like, well, therefore we've got the evidence.
Yeah.
Whereas the evidence, both on effectiveness and safety, of course, is a long way from simply having the data. And I think, I was going to make a comment anyway, but along these lines, that really I think one function of this centre could really be to be at the very forefront of methodology, because this is new ground for the world, really. To what extent these data do and are able to be translated into reliable evidence that can guide regulators is critical. And in a way, the agency is at the kind of very forefront of that, because it is where the crunch happens. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity in many ways, and a great need. Really, as David said, mapping out what are the future needs in this whole area, what's missing in terms of methodology and applications, I think would be a real key part of this.
Yeah, and a real opportunity to shape the future. Anthony, I know you've been waving at me. Is that to do with CPRD and real-world evidence, or is it something different?
Yeah, no, it's to do with this point actually, and
yeah.
It was my point, is that I think what's interesting is there's two things. So the first thing is what's missing for me that we used to communication is the listification from the organisation strategy to think about how we as a board can see those groundbreaking publications. So on moving back to the point of real world evidence and real world data, we've just seen, for example, CPRD had a seminal in Nature regarding the synthetic data sets that they've been working on. And I think there's some really exciting and innovative areas that we are leading and we're not seeing at the moment. So that's more of a plea for, I don't know how we do it, but if we could get to see that communication, that would be great. Second point is CPRD, absolutely right. I think we've started, we had a steering committee last week for the board members who know I'm the sort of support person to the CPRD on your behalf. And we've been talking about when we were going to hit that tipping point in industry where they would really start to see the value of how we capitalize on to evidence. And I have to say, from the contracts, I won't go into detail here, obviously, but we have signed a large number of significantly large number of contracts, value-wise, as well as academically, over the past couple of months that you'll start to see rolling through with organisations such as Gates, for example. And so I think that tipping point that we've been talking about, and Liam, I think probably because of COVID, we've seen industry have been looking at how they can do this as trials have closed down. We're seeing the funding going into these areas of research, and we are definitely at the leading edge. The contracts are coming our way.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't catch everything you said, Anthony, because the line keeps breaking up, unfortunately. But I think the point that more information on CPRD and real-world evidence will be helpful is what I did pick up. And I think it probably is about time we had another board review of where we are with CPRD, probably in the new year. I would imagine might be a good time to be thinking of that.
Yeah,
okay.
but just in case you missed it, it's a fact that we have now got the contracts and money coming through. People are recognising CPRD's value externally.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. David, back to your third point, please.
Yeah, I've got 2 points, third and fourth, but I'm going to just fill in one here as well. Going back to what people have said before, the FDA routinely publishes in the New England Journal of Medicine. NICE routinely publishes short versions of what it does in the BMJ. Maybe MHRA ought to be thinking about putting its most exciting regulatory science into the BMJ or the Lancet. I think there's an opportunity here to have a home journal that we'll work with. Anyway, two more.
Final 2 points, David, then we'll move on to someone else, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. So these are smaller. In the paper, it talks about the growing number of tumour markers, genomic standards, and the fact that they are growing faster than anyone can regulate them. And it's a question for Christian here, in that if it's you're never going to catch up, is there a way of setting a minimum data set required for publication of new markers that would provide some sort of control and standardization that we can trust? Or in a global market, global community, is that just too difficult? So that's one question.
Christian?
Would you like me to respond to this one?
Please.
The problem is that we are talking about genomic reference standards. So these are physical standards, in other words, small vials, if you wish, where there is a certain genomic, genomic sequences in this, and these are very complex to make. So you can't really say, if it was a written standard that we would do, then of course we could come up with minimum requirements, but the physical standard must be compliant with the requirements. So we can't really be different there. And since they are so complex, it requires one scientist to work 1 or 2 years to work on a single standard. This is just the reality. So we have been focusing on the most important areas.
So how are you going to deal with the fact that there are literally thousands of standards probably being created each week or month? How are you going to keep ahead, keep afloat?
Well, basically, we do this by prioritizing those which are, I use the term druggable, so where you can find targeted treatments against certain mutations. So you can do this, and this is where good horizon scanning comes in for those areas where a number of different targets are in development or are already authorized so that they are relevant, or others which support cutting edge diagnostic procedures of wider applicability. So for example, liquid biopsies, that means that you can identify a tumor from a blood test and not from a biopsy, which is much more invasive and sometimes not even possible to do. And so you just take a blood test because the tumor will shed DNA into the blood and you will detect it. But these are very small amounts of DNA that you will detect, and of course prone to error. And this is why such a standard requires such diligence, so that it does not invoke any diagnosis, unwanted diagnosis of tumors, or maybe miss out on diagnosis. So these areas we have been prioritizing, and we have no choice then other than to do this in future as well, obviously.
Okay. Final point, David.
Last one. And that's really about being at the cutting edge of science. Obviously, you can do most things with a laptop nowadays, but certain sorts of science, and particularly the sort that goes on at NIBSC, often requires pretty expensive equipment, sometimes very expensive equipment. And I just wonder it's very easy to get behind the cutting edge and then not be able to regulate as effectively as you would wish. And I'm just wanted to ask Christian, through you, Stephen, how NIBSC thinks it will stay at the forefront of its regulatory and control and standardization activities, how it will gain the access it needs to those new pieces of expensive kit.
Stephen, if you allow, I'm answering this directly. So indeed, this is an important point. NIBSC has a science oversight committee, a research oversight committee, where the heads of the various scientific divisions are members, and they are discussing their wish list, so to speak, for capital investment. So obviously NIBSC gets a certain amount of capital funding. The price of new technology obviously has increased quite a bit. So we will have to have a good mixture of own equipment that we buy, of maxing out the equipment that we already have in a smarter way, if that is possible. And also to collaborate with academia, because it could well be, and it is very likely, that the excellent life sciences infrastructure in the UK actually has equipment which NIBSC could use in order to perform its science. So we may not have to buy each and every piece of equipment, but for some of them, I think it is inevitable, because we would use it 24 hours a day, so to speak. So then it doesn't make sense to outsource it, because we would block others' access to it. And this is exactly what the Research Oversight Committee at NIBSC should be doing. And it's doing.
Okay. Barbara, I know you waved at me furiously earlier on in the conversation. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I've got a minor second point now as well, if I can be quick. The first thing is I wanted to ask the team and Christian about his Centre for Research and Innovation, and to ask if this includes developments in devices, medical devices. MHRA has a really good background of expertise and experience in medicines, and including advanced medicines, but devices both in the UK and elsewhere have been a little bit more difficult to approach in a coordinated way. And I'm interested particularly about advanced devices which need material sciences and engineering expertise to regulate them, and mixed devices, and the most familiar ones already widely on the market, of course, are glucose measuring devices that people can wear, which tell them when to take insulin or to miss a dose, and even some of them now deliver the insulin without having the patient to intervene. Have you looked at that, and how are we with our excellent primary care particularly, and some data links as well, in regulation and vigilance for those?
Christian?
Yes, thank you. This is indeed an important question. I would be excited to take devices into this. So obviously combined advanced therapies, for example, or combined medicine devices, products are extremely important. It would be exciting to find out, and we are already doing this, obviously, where the two disciplines, if you wish, medicines and medical devices, can learn from each other. So not to shoehorn devices into the medicines or other way around, but where we can learn from both disciplines, because there are commonalities but also differences in regulation. So obviously regulatory science would be a very interesting and important piece to play there. And you were referring earlier to where our strengths are, and I think one of the strengths of this agency is that devices and medicines are regulated under one roof. So that is obviously creating a good opportunity to actually do this. So I will take note of that for the next iteration of the work.
Okay,
thank you. Two quickies, if I may, Chairman. One for June. In our MOU with NIBSC, are we laying any ground to collaborate and coordinate with these sort of devices?
Do you mean NICE rather than NIBSC?
Sorry, NICE, yes.
June?
I'm having abbreviation confusion here.
No worries.
Yes, in our work with NICE, we've had a quite long-standing arrangement, particularly with their technology limb of work. So certainly where we go on the scientific and regulatory science agenda, we will be doing it absolutely hand in hand with NIBSC. They have a new appointment looking at scientific and use of data. So it's an ideal time for us to consolidate this work.
Okay.
And finally, again, to Christian, I think it's clear how difficult it is to hurry when you're making an international standard, which must be impeccable, but it doesn't stop the process of vigilance, which would reveal if something was causing harm in the diagnostic or therapeutic sense. I think it'd be interesting to ask the vigilance people if they get any signals from genomic or biological diagnostic materials, and we're using them a lot at the moment in COVID. It would be interesting to know.
Christian?
Yeah, thanks. So briefly to respond on this, indeed, there is some sorts of standards vigilance, if you wish, because obviously if there are complaints or technical defects, we will be alerted. If we get alerts in, it's the same like with medicines. It must, of course, be sent in, otherwise we can't know about it. But I think it will be, it is a good point to follow up, indeed, how we can improve that.
Yeah.
Very good idea, actually.
Thank you all.
There's lots of questions still. I don't think we're going to be able to get through them all, but I'd probably like to give Kathy Harrison the last chance to ask a question on this particular topic, and then we'll need to move on, I'm afraid. So, Kathy, what was your point?
Stephen, thank you. And Christian, thank you so much for such an exciting paper. My question is just how will the agency ensure that this exciting agenda is truly UK-wide? And also, does that aspect of the work of the agency need to be set out a little bit more deliberately in some of in the paper perhaps, and also in wider communications that will associate it with this work, and even the idea about that David said about publication? It's important that we are promoting ourselves across the world truly as UK-wide. Thank you.
That's a great point, actually, Kathy. Thank you. Christian, any initial reaction?
Thank you. Well, indeed, this is a very important point. I should say that as a scientist, I do not even make that distinction. For me, this is UK-wide. Science doesn't know any differences. So, but of course, we will have to look how we can communicate this, how we can collaborate, and maybe even identify where we have to maybe steer more actively, so that this is actually UK-wide. I would personally agree with you.
Okay, that's great. Okay, I'm really sorry. I think we're going to need to move on. So I know Mandy and Liam both want to ask other questions, but maybe we can either pick them up later, or if there's no time, maybe actually just contact Christian directly outside the meeting. But I think it's been a really good conversation, Christian. I think in terms of, there's a real level of interest, a real level of support from the board behind what we're doing here. I think there's still going to be an issue of prioritisation. I think that's going to that's one of the next steps. I think how we actually publish ourselves from a UK-wide basis, I think that last point is very valid, but actually get into journals more regularly is clearly something else to think about. And then particularly also how we work with the likes of NICE. So there were just some of the many topics, but I think it's been a really fruitful discussion. And I think I look forward to coming back to that again in the near future. Okay, with that in mind, I think we should move on. So apologies for that. And also just say hello to Greg Chalmers, who's managed to join us. So thank you, Greg, for joining us today. We'll move on to the next item onto the agenda, which is around patient safety. And Sam, this is around the assurance the MHRA enforcement group can protect patient and public health by working with global partners. So can you give us the highlights, please, from your paper?
Indeed, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to cover off probably three areas, really. Firstly, that we very much have a global supply chain, and therefore the enforcement activity is very much a global activity. Secondly, that enforcement is complex. And thirdly, I'm going to touch on the enforcement approach. So just going to the initial point in terms of it being a global supply chain, it's really key, and obviously just provided in the paper, it describes how we're working with other regulators and enforcement teams to disrupt criminality, but at the source. This has been particularly successful and has required working with others in the UK as well, like with the likes of the UK Border Force, for example. We have particularly good relationships and have seen success with collaborations with the US, with the Republic of Ireland, and indeed India. Just as an example, the enforcement group have received around 75 actionable intelligence reports from European Union member states in the year to March 2020 alone. So you can see there's quite a lot of activity happening across these global collaborations. We have been trying to disrupt routes because criminality is quite complex. One recent piece of work has resulted in criminals changing their approach. In other words, they were using an India route, and that's now moved to Singapore. So working with India through a postal hub exercise, we were able to intercept a huge amount of products leaving India. And by the very fact that the criminality has shifted, that actually does demonstrate a success in terms of that relationship. I mentioned that the enforcement activity is complex. I mean, we have to consider a number of different factors. Firstly, you can see product going one way, one particular supply route, for example, but you also have the financial elements, which could be moving in a different pattern, and indeed consumables such as packaging and the like going in a further route as well. So having to really disrupt all of these variety of different routes of criminality is really quite key. We're also very alert and alive to the fact that there are current threats around vaccines, and we're working very closely with the National Crime Agency, who are very much on top of this, and we're obviously supporting them in that. The enforcement approach then, if I can just move on to that briefly. Currently, I mean, I say currently, over the last number of years, we have worked very much in terms of quite a linear approach. So moving from investigation to prosecute to reporting, and I'd say that feels quite linear. We are now looking at a slightly different structure and a different approach in the future, which will be much more holistic. So looking at prevention, so really treating the symptoms sorry, not just treating the symptoms, looking at other things such as offender focus to stop people becoming offenders, and also looking at demand focused prevention. Disruption is the second element of this, so we're looking to use multiple tools such as account freezing orders, and I'd say over the last year we've, I think, recouped around, well, over $1 million in confiscation orders through account freezing orders, so a really useful tool to disrupt criminality and really make it quite difficult to offend. And then the third element of the future holistic approach would be through the normal route of prosecution. I'd also say that criminality is changing. It's very much online now. In 2020, analysis conducted by the National Crime Agency identified in the region of 150,000 illegal listings of medicines on the dark web alone over a 12-month period. I think that really does demonstrate the issue at hand. I mean, ultimately, all roads lead to online. So it doesn't matter where the products are, where they're being manufactured, how they're being moved around. Ultimately, the risk is the access to them from an online source. So building on the likes of Pangaea and other activities that the enforcement group have undertaken over the year and this change in approach, we are developing new strategies to target online offending much more robustly. It's somewhat, as with everything, dependent on funding, but we are changing those approaches nonetheless. And we're also looking to improve our key performance indicators, so how much we put in and what we actually get out, really moving towards an outcome-focused approach. So I hope that gives an overview, but it is an interesting area, a very live area at the moment, and one which really does see some complex work, but some real successes too. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
That's great, thank you, Sam. I think what struck me when I read the paper was just the sheer scale of the activities that we're involved in. You know, these are substantial quantities of illegal, products. And the criminal networks are clearly, very advanced. So it's difficult work, and we've clearly got a very diligent team. And I think we should just record our thanks to the enforcement group for all they do to keep us all safe. I think as far as that's concerned. So if I could just come to questions. So. Bruce, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, two brief questions. The first about incentives and the second about disincentives. And my first question is, for countries like India, which as far as I can see, our collaboration with them is because illicit stuff is coming from them. What is the incentive to them for putting a lot of time and trouble and money into collaborating with us? And my question about disincentives is that my memory from a previous board discussion of this, perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, was that in the context of things that can harm many people and even cause death, the penalties seem to be just absurdly trivial. And I just wondered what moves were being made to try to create a greater disincentive to people for doing this.
That's an interesting question. Sam, have you got any initial reaction to that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen. Thank you for the questions. Firstly, in relation to India, India very, very much promote themselves as the pharmacy of the world, and it's really key to them that the product coming through India and out of India is obviously safe and effective and reliable. And so, of course, they see there's great benefit in trying to help and collaborate. And you know, I think we have seen really great relationships and collaborations with the Indian regulatory authorities and the enforcement groups to really move forward on this. So I think that's primarily the reason. I mean, they don't want poor product coming from India, much like we wouldn't from here. In terms of the harm and the penalties, it's always a challenge, this one. It has been for a long time. We've always felt it's not necessarily appropriate. There are other routes that we can look at, and indeed we've used fraud as a possible different route, but that's much more complex, requires a greater level of information to really take anything down for prosecution. I mean, Chairman, I don't know whether Elizabeth might want to comment on the possibility of having different penalties at this point.
Okay, well, why don't we ask Elizabeth from the Government Legal Department, the idea of disincentives for illegal or criminal activity, Elizabeth, is there anything else that we can do to strengthen the disincentives, do you think?
I think it's difficult to give a clear sort of indication at this stage. It seems to be, you know, it's not just a legal issue, actually it's a policy, it's a mixed policy and legal issue, and considering and adjusting a legal regime to strengthen it are some things that require a great deal of time.
Yeah.
It seems to be, I mean, from Sam's report and from how we're experiencing it, I have not been involved in work that is aimed at strengthening it to date, so I can't really meaningfully comment.
Okay. I think we recognise that it is a complex area. So, but thank you for that, Elizabeth. And that's probably something we do need to come back to. I think, Bruce, just in terms of, you know, it'll have to fit in with government priorities and everything else. But you know, we want to keep patients in the UK safe, and this is one of the ways we can do that. So I think that's probably the point. Mercy, I think you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, just a comment, being new to the board as well, about knowing, you know, finding out about the scale of this. It's huge, isn't it? I'm trying to keep on top of it. I'm really glad about the international collaboration. So I want to ask a bit more about prioritization of vaccine fraud, which, you know, is going to be kind of key. But also just to understand a little bit, so I've learned about this pyramid. And in your paragraph 5, Sam, it talks about the detrimental upward progression and beneficial downward influence. I don't quite understand what that means, moving through the pyramid. I understand the kind of the bottom up, you know, lots of different things, but smaller, you know, kind of smaller infringements at the bottom, and then kind of major complex stuff at the top. I don't understand the beneficially going the other way, as it were. Can you just explain that a little bit for me?
Yeah, Sam?
If I could just touch on the vaccine fraud first. I mean, clearly, as I said, we're working with the NCA, the National Crime Authorities, to actually move that forward, and that's obviously a priority for them. I'm just looking at the pyramid. Yeah, it probably isn't particularly clear, is it? Probably need to have a think about how we could better describe that. Yeah, can I come back to you on that one, Mercy? Okay, apologies. It's a sort of
okay.
Yeah, description.
It wasn't meant to be a trick question. I think it's genuinely just trying to understand what's a very complex area. I think that's the point. So, okay, Michael, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, just 2 points really. One is just from I really like the paper, and as ever, it's very insightful. I think as we go forward, Stephen, my only observation would be to the papers of this nature. If the board is seeking assurance, I find it difficult to know what level of resource we as an agency are devoting to this. Is it the right level of resource? And Sam makes reference to the performance indicators. So I just think these papers going forward could give us an indication of that, because I think as we've got less and less resource going forward, we're going to have to take some quite important decisions. And so I think a bit more transparency around that would be helpful from my perspective.
Although just to counter that, Michael, I think we do need to be careful what's talked about in the public domain on specific resources around seeking criminal activity. So I think we'd have to maybe think about the right forum for that discussion. The discussion needs to take place. I just think we need to think of the right forum. And that might be actually Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, for example.
I fully accept that. It's just the principle generally. And I want to stress, I'm not about taking resource away. I'm just about ensuring that we've got the right level of resource to that. And my more substantive question was, I was really interested in what Sam said about a more holistic approach. And I really support that thing about beginning to understand demand more. And I just was going to ask the more general question. Have we got much research that's been done around demand nationally, internationally? And I just wondered, as a nation, you know, are we more likely to go down this route, trying to get drugs and medical or whatever it is, because we can't get them within our own system? I'm just interested in, have we done enough analysis of demand?
So I suppose the question there, Sam, is really sort of, is the UK more exposed to this criminal activity than other countries? That's what I've interpreted from it. So, you know, from your intelligence, what would you say the answer to that is?
I think it's very much a global problem, if I'm honest. I don't think, I mean, going back to what I said about it being online, online isn't country specific. It's very much a global supply chain. We've all got that same global supply chain. This is about collaboration. It's about working together. I wouldn't necessarily say that any particular country is better or worse. We do have different levels of enforcement, and I think that probably does enable a better control or not. And in the UK, we certainly have a very robust enforcement group that works very actively and is renowned worldwide. So I think we're actually in a very good position because of that, and also because of the relationships we have built and the learnings we've taken from the years gone by.
Okay, thank you for that. Kathy, was that an old hand from you, or is this a new question? Okay, and Liam, how about you? Is that a question from you? No. Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's been a helpful discussion. So I guess the question is, are we assured? I think in terms of, I think we're assured of the scale of this, Sam. There's no question. I think we're assured that this highly complex area. I think it will be worth coming back to you know, when we're discussing about budgets and resources for next year, to make sure that, you know, we gain you know, probably confidential assurance around the level of resource that we're putting into this particular area, but that's probably not a topic that we can discuss in public, I would suggest. But I think on that basis, I think we'll move on to the next topic, if I may. And Michael, we're talking about risk. As the chair of the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, I know you had a meeting on the 2nd of November. We're looking at page 34 in the board pack. Do you want to just take us through the key highlights from your assurance report, please?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Chair. Can I start by, because there are members of the public listening and also colleagues within the MHRA, just to summarise very briefly what we are seeking to do. So ARAC has three broad responsibilities. We are very keen to understand that the controls within the agency operate effectively, both in terms of financial regularity, cost control, and also delivering value for money. And we get independent assurance from internal audit and external audit, both of whom are external to the organisation. They provide the evidence on which we formulate our judgments. Our second objective is really about financial resilience. Are we confident that the organisation's financial position is sufficiently strong going forward to deliver the service that we are required to deliver to the public? And finally, we focus on risk. And here we are very much about, is risk within the organisation managed effectively, both to mitigate anything that might go wrong, but also equally to promote and support innovation, which is important in the development of public health. From time to time as well, the board will ask us to look at specific issues like all the other committees, and that's where I'd like to start. So the board at its last meeting asked us to do two things. One was to look at the risks, were we confident that the risks relating to the agency's response to COVID-19 were being managed effectively. And also the second request was, given that the agency is changing its operating model, are we confident that we will be sufficiently resilient to manage risks that might come before us? You know, and that regards the point that Stephen mentioned under the action log, about different scenarios that we might face. So if I could start with the first one, we looked quite extensively at the risk register relating to COVID-19, both at a global level within the agency and at a more detailed level, which largely falls under Sam's control. I mean, we got reasonable assurance that, well, more than reasonable assurance, good assurance that the agency was managing the response to COVID-19 effectively to ensure patient safety. And that is the key thing. And I would reiterate my support for the statement that the Chief Executive made publicly at the same platform as the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, that I think the agency is doing everything possible to manage the risk to patient safety through separation of duties from industry, through surveillance, and having good evidence on which to base decisions. We're also concerned to be clear that COVID is requiring a considerable response from the agency, and we wanted to be sure that this was not having an adverse impact on people's well-being or any other aspects of internal control that would suggest that money was being used inappropriately. We found no evidence to suggest that, and we took positive assurance. On the second issue around future resourcing, future scenarios, we think that's best done through looking at risk, and we are clear that as the agency goes forward, as it agrees its new operating model, inevitably there will be risks as well as benefits, and that's where we want to start, and we will be doing that at subsequent audit committee meetings and looking at the best way in which we can report that back to the board. I should say as well that as we introduce a new governance, a new board structure and executive team, we have asked internal audit to provide independent assurance that that new governance structure is working effectively, and that will come to our act before the end of the financial year. Very briefly, if I could just say under the three other headings. So if I take the issue that we routinely look at, which is internal control, we took a number of reports. I'm not going to focus on those, but there was nothing that I would want to bring to the board's attention at this point in time to suggest that there was any weakening of controls. The second issue that we looked at was financial resilience. This is a much more difficult issue. I think we all know that because of changes, we do have an ongoing structural deficit that we do need to address. We have action in plan as an agency, action in hand, which is around restructuring. But the message we want to give to the board is we cannot now lose any more time. We put a lot of effort into thinking about the future. The key message now is around pace and delivery and making sure that we begin to make those structural changes, that we become financially resilient. And I know we'll be talking more about that this afternoon and subsequently. We also looked at fees, and this is a difficult issue as well. Our fee structure needs revision. It needs to be much more closely aligned to our costs. And what we recommend to the agency is that we do need a transparent pricing strategy. I know John Fundray and colleagues accept that, and that will need to come to the board at some point, I would suggest over the next 12 months, if not sooner. And then the final point that we focused on as part of our routine business is looking at the risk register. We were very pleased to note that the agency has made major advances in improving its risk register, making it much more strategic, and we gained assurance that it is focusing on the right things. Inevitably, however, there's always scope for improvement and development, and we do think there is still some more work to be done about looking at the synergies between risks and focusing on those big ticket items, about continuing to maintain public trust, supporting public health as part of a wider member of the health family of the organisation of health bodies that are focused on promoting public health. And we also felt that some of the mitigating actions in the risk register could have greater detail, greater granularity, and could be time limited so that we can actually see what their impact is and whether something that is designated remains a risk going forward. So a good meeting, Stephen, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues for the support, and they may wish to add to my summary. Thanks very much.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Michael. I think it just shows this is good governance in action. I think the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee was delegated some actions to provide assurance to the board, and you've clearly done that in a diligent way. Maybe I could just come to June first of all. June, because obviously you're not only Chief Executive, you're also the Accounting Officer. And I just wondered if there's any observations from the assurance paper that Michael has written that you would just like to make the board aware of. If there's anything else you'd like to add, any context?
Thank you, Chair. I would like, first of all, to register the importance of this report, particularly at this time, and the messages that we received at a very productive meeting around the assurances on our preparedness for COVID, the change, the importance of a living risk register, and pace in terms of where the agency is heading. So I found it an extraordinarily helpful meeting, and the focus that it gives us as we go forward as the executive is invaluable.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Sorry just to jump on you, but I thought it was important to hear the executive perspective too. So, okay, Anthony, do you want to kick us off with a question?
Yeah, it's actually more of a comment because of the IRAC committee, but won't be going forward. And the focus that we put on internal audit, looking at the value of the new structure, Michael, was around, is it working? Are we picking up if something goes wrong, and are we handling it correctly? And it occurs to me, I've been thinking about it since then, one area we haven't looked at as a board is the impact of the new structure on the operational side of the organisation. The new committees are very executive focused. And I just want to make sure we understand, and perhaps we could do it through this internal audit report, directors and managers feel that they are engaged in this new system in the same way they were, obviously, when they were going to meetings and they were attending. And does that side of the system work effectively now? Now, it might not be an ARAC question, Michael. It might be a question for June to come back and assure us in another way. But we have totally redefined the structure at one level, and I'm not really sure what's happening in the other side as a board member. So I leave it with you and Michael to decide where.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be the operational. It could actually be the organisational development committee. We could look at it, but I just think it's something that needs looking at.
Yeah. Okay. So Michael, in terms of the internal audit approach, what is the intended brief for that first?
The internal audit approach, inevitably, because quite rightly at the year end, this is a significant change, and you need to report with the annual accounts that there's been no weakening in governance, and that's the basic bread and butter stuff. So that's start one. I think Mandy made some very useful, as Tony, observations around. We have set some new priorities, particularly about enhancing public trust, support to patients and those sorts of things. At a very limited level, could internal audit give us some assurance that the new structure is likely to be supporting those new objectives that we are setting itself? So I don't want to overplay it. Given the skill set of internal audit, its primary focus will be internal control, but it's also then looking at synergy with our overall board objectives for the organisation.
I think from experience, internal audit reports work best when there's a very clear, specific focus. And I suppose I'd maybe just turn to June again in terms of what areas you think you're going to get the most value of, because at the end of the day, you're the person who has to sign the account, the governance statement at the end. Do you think actually the internal audit should actually move more into the operational, or should we address that through a different route and keep the internal audit focused very much on governance?
I think at the moment, thank you, Stephen, that there is, because we've had a significant change in governance, a real need to answer the question, has there been any weakening? And I hope in the process of doing that we would demonstrate actually in the areas of change, we have strengthened or filled in gaps that were insufficiently subject to appropriate governance. After all, for example, with the Cumberledge report, we had effectively an audit, and there are various other aspects that we're well aware of that we need to look at. So hopefully with a focus on the governance change, that will deliver, if you like, that broader picture for us.
Yeah, so I think June steers the start on governance, but I think there's still, Anthony makes a point around the operational side of the business and how we actually ultimately gain assurance that that new committee structure is working. But maybe that's sort of a second step at a point after this first step. Mandy, you're obviously on the ARAC committee. What was your question or comment?
Okay, yeah, it was really supporting that and the work we've done on risk management. I think previously we had a very strong bottom-up risk management, which came from the divisions. So that was picking up many of the aspects that Antony highlighted around the operational activities within a division. I think the change that we've brought with reviewing the strategy is also giving a strategic look and a top-down view linking to the four strategic priorities for the agency. So I think we do have the mechanism both to look at the risks as they come from bottom up, but what was really missing, what we identified a year ago, was this lack of an agency-wide view of risk and taking it in terms of the strategic priorities. So I think we have the ability to look at both, but I think we have addressed a gap that we perceived last year.
I think that's an important context, actually, is that, you know, this is again showing the governance is working. We're identifying issues, they're being discussed in detail, and then solutions that ultimately will be presented. So I think that's a good perspective. And I think we need to do more and make sure these new mechanisms are working. I think that's the key message that I've taken away from that. Okay, were there any other questions from anyone else on the board? Or anyone else? Okay. Right, okay, so I think we've been asked to note the likely end of year financial position that Michael's described in the paper. You know, we've talked about the work in terms of continuing to strengthen our risk management. I think that's good. And then obviously there was a recommendation around better aligning the fee structure in long term. Yeah, the fee structure in particular will not just be an agency decision. You know, that's something we have to work in conjunction with Department of Health and social care on, and potentially, depending what happens, there could even be you know, some sort of legal impact required in terms of statutory instruments and so forth. So we'll have to work that one through, Michael, but I think the point's well made that we need to work on it. The final mechanism we'll have to you know, come back to. Okay, so I think we can note the report, and thank you for the assurance. So that's very much looking backwards. We've now got an opportunity to look forwards, and John Fundry, can we talk about the dynamic organisation and the strategic priorities for the next corporate plan? John, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, just thinking forward to the corporate plan and also our business plan. For the benefit of those joining us for the first time, the corporate plan normally has a longer timeline, a longer duration perspective. The business plan tends to focus on the key activities on the ensuing period. So in the paper, we set out in paragraph 2 some of the context. That gives us the challenges and opportunities we have. Clearly, as we've already discussed a lot today, we've got EU exit on the 1st of January. That then brings us to the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill as a consequence. We've revitalised our change strategy to address some of those challenges. We spent a lot of time today talking about our existing COVID-19 response, and that will continue next year and beyond, particularly in the kind of surveillance areas. And then finally, our spending review bid highlighted some of the opportunities to support the entire sector across the UK and the whole life sciences sector. So those are some of the challenges. Setting out a strategy in the medium term with so many moving parts is a little bit hard for us, I think. So we're suggesting that instead of the usual 5-year duration for the corporate plan, we're suggesting 2 years plus an outline third, which we would then come back to review. And then the business plan focusing in detail over the next year, primarily focusing on our change strategy and what we need to do post 1st of January. As you can see from the paper in paragraph 12, The timelines actually to do that in time are quite tight, but we think we can do it. And paragraph 5 sets out some of the possible strategic priorities that we would intend to set out in that corporate plan and deliver through the mechanisms of the business plan. And we'd welcome the board's views on those priorities and that approach.
Okay, thank you, John. Well, certainly sort of following on from the publication of the papers last week, you know that I've got a particular strong view around planning. And I think particularly with the number of strategically vitally important issues we've got to deal with, I think we need to go ahead with a single plan for 2 years. And I say that because I think the complexity of writing a corporate plan for 2 years and then a business plan for 1 year, I think then there's a risk of things getting lost in the mix. And I think it's going to be really important that we prioritize the key things that we're going to do. Then we need to resource these areas, these priority areas, so that we can do multiple things in parallel, because we haven't got the luxury of time to do these things in sequence. And so I'm sort of envisaging that we should be looking at a single plan for 2 years with very clear deliverables in terms of accountabilities and timescales, and make sure that these areas are properly resourced so that we haven't got multiple plans around the agency. I think we need absolute focus. And I would regard this 2-year plan as really a delivery plan for the next 2 years. These are the commitments we're going to make. It's going to be complex to put together, I get that, but I think if we can't be clear, then I think the agency will not necessarily achieve everything it needs to. And I think that's why I feel quite strongly about that. I think also, before I come to questions, it's probably appropriate just to ask our sponsor, so Alistair Hardesty from Department of Health, again, from your point of view, what would you be looking for from an agency plan before we get into the detail?
Yeah, sure, thanks, Stephen. So I think it's really important that we really, I agree with you basically, that we do focus on deliverability. I think it's really important that we have a plan that sets out what we're going to achieve and then stick to it. I think that's important for transparency purposes, because it's important that we do the things that we say that we're going to. But I think it's also important that we set out what the opportunities and the challenges are to the agency. And as I'm from the department, I think it's really important for 2 things. First of all, I think it's really important for patient safety perspective. So I think it's really permanent kind of concern to me as sponsor to make sure that the agency sticks to its safety remit. And then because I hold the purse strings as well, I think it's really important that we see that within the context of financial sustainability for the agency as well. And I know that's challenging. We don't yet have the readout from a spending review. We know that it's going to be a spending review that's for a year, so that's a challenge for you for setting that out within your business plan and corporate plan. But yeah, really keen to work very closely with you on this to make sure that our priorities within the department are reflected within yours, and that the Russian doll of nesting works well in terms of read through to the activities that you're going to be doing over the next year or so. Thank you.
Yeah, that's helpful, Al. Thank you very much for that, because I think we can't do this in isolation. It has to actually fit into the wider health agenda. I think it also has to work for the devolved administrations as well. So I wonder, Alison, just from your point of view, from Scotland, how would you want to be involved in our corporate planning to have a sort of a greater voice than perhaps you maybe had in the past? If I can just surprise you by asking you the question.
It's no problem at all, and I'm sure Greg will have a view from the kind of medical devices perspective too, but I think we would really welcome to have that greater involvement. And it's really important from our perspective that as we look at this on a kind of UK-wide basis, that we're able to map that across to all of our structures and organisations. And I'm sure Kathy's got the same views from a kind of Northern Ireland perspective, as would Andrew from Wales. So I think we would really welcome that opportunity. We've been working very hard to strengthen our relationships, I think, and very successfully doing so, as we've gone through the last kind of 3 to 6 months. And I think COVID's given us a great opportunity to really kind of find ways of getting around some of the kind of barriers that may have been there, perceived or actual in the past. But Greg may want to say a little bit on the devices front as well. Thank you.
Greg, how would you want to be involved in our corporate planning process?
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, colleagues. First of all, Stephen and colleagues, thanks for indulging me for arriving late. Apologies about that. Do you know that there's a? I suppose there's a kind of generic point here which wouldn't want to miss making. I noticed on in paragraph 12, where are we? 12E, which is on page 41 of the papers there.
Yep.
Very, very helpfully, you've got the devolved administrations in there as somebody that you'll want to consult with, and as Alison has said, we welcome that. I suppose there's a point of status here, hopefully not one of ego, but one of status that we like to draw out in these sort of discussions with UK public bodies. But we'll want to have a discussion with you, of course.
Yeah.
I suppose the point that we'd want to kind of underline is that we would hope to have a discussion with you after you've had your discussion with industry, with the public, when you're at the point of I understand, I've done this many times, it would be quite an organic thing, but in terms of timing, but when you're at the point where you're deciding what it is that you're going to recommend to the sponsor department.
Yeah.
Because
I think that point's well made, Greg, actually, because I think I don't see this as a one-off contact. We have regular meetings with the devolved administrations. This should be a key point on those meetings. I can't remember when the next meeting is actually with Scotland, but we need to make sure that's the case, as with Northern Ireland and as with Wales as well. So I think there needs to be more of a dialogue than just simply a one-off consultation. I don't think that quite does justice to what we'd intended, to be fair.
No, that makes sense. I mean, particularly in this coming year, as the transition period ends, and you've got the bill becoming an act, there'll be a lot of strategic discussions to have, and I'm sure, I think we can just help you and the department navigate those with what will always be kind of political sensitivities.
Yeah.
But thanks for that.
That's helpful. Kathy, was there anything else you wanted to add from Northern Ireland before we open up to the rest of the board?
Stephen, no, nothing specific other than the next 2 years obviously we'll see Northern Ireland in a very different position as it has been, and I will be relying very heavily on the support of the agency as I've had completely up to now. Yeah. And I think that our relationship will perhaps change a little bit, and I think that I'm sure that will be reflected in the corporate plan in terms of the need for the emphasis on Northern Ireland issues moving forward as we both learn what the new normal is going to become there.
I think there's still decisions to be made, aren't there? But we absolutely want to make sure that you get the support, but also patients in Northern Ireland continue to get new medicines and existing medicines in the same way they do before the 1st of January 2021. So we're on the same side on this, so we want to make sure it works. Okay, so let's open the discussion a little wider. So Mandy, I think you were first. Any observations around the corporate plan and our priorities for the future?
Yes, a couple of things. I think the idea of having one plan and keeping that simple is it's a very good idea. And I think I'd also just sort of think about the process of planning, getting those dialogues right is as important as the final plan, because things change. And I think we need to have that the plan as the guide, but it needs to be kept relevant, and so that dialogue is really important. And I think the other thing about implementation, and this comes back to communication, is that we need to be very clear on describing why we're doing certain things, both to our staff and to our stakeholders, because if the money doesn't quite add up, or we have to make some really hard priorities, the understanding why we're doing that is much more important than just having a line in the plan. So I think that's going to require a slightly different approach on how we both develop the plan, keep it current, but also implement it.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think that's helpful. Christian, do you want to weigh in next in terms of your perspective?
Thanks. Well, I'm just building on the discussion we've had before on the science and regulatory science in particular paper. And obviously with what the board has discussed and agreed on that, I wonder if this should feature then more prominently in the corporate plan as well, because currently we've got it there very focused rather on the new innovative and access licensing pathway in point 5b, and we've got in 5e more on the proposition of the agency CPRD and other data services and for NIPS on standards. So obviously that is NIPSCI again and CPRD, but the question is if we want to add regulatory science more explicitly into this.
Yeah, I think actually bear in mind the interest we had in the first conversation, that probably makes a lot of sense. I can see June nodding. Do you want to add in on that one, June?
Well, fully agree. And in a way, what we're saying is that the one United Kingdom approach is evolving, and the regulatory science network that we'll seek to build will be a key part of our plan for the next 2 years.
Okay, thank you for that. Michael, do you want to come in now, please?
Yeah, I really support what you're saying, Stephen, about a 2-year delivery plan. I suppose a number of factors for me is some of this is easier to do than others, and I think it's very important that in the past I've seen corporate plans or delivery plans be quite linear, but I'd be really interested to have absolute transparency about what we think are the easy, quick wins within that, and what are the real difficult things that, you know, the enablers that we want to get right, but are particularly challenging, so that as we go forward and the board is supporting the delivery of this plan, we're pretty clear up front what are the real difficult things that we've got to tackle, because I think there are things in there. So it's not about the content, it's really about building on what Mandy said around delivery. 2 other very quick points from me. I think it's also, do the sum of the parts of the corporate plan make something that we are all 100% behind? And when I get that, I was very struck at a couple of board meetings back when I think it was Bruce said, well, who knows about the MHRA, it's brand. And the question mark I've got really is, going forward, we could do all this and we could do it very well, but we might not have that much public profile and we could still be successful. So for me, it's a question about public profile, you know, what's our appetite in that space, because that will influence how you do some of these things. And the reason why I say that is, my subject's history and I'm still fascinated by it. I think in 2 years from now, there will be some interesting work done about how public bodies fared in a post-EU world. You know, have they realised all the opportunities? And I do this in a very positive way, not negative. So I think it's important to be clear about what we think we will look like at the end of this 2-year period. It's a bit more vague, I know, not precise.
I'm not sure. I wouldn't call it vague, Michael, because I think actually you've picked up on something we talked about earlier as well from the scientific point of view. So I think there's a public profile aspect of what is the work that we do, trust, how we're keeping patients safe. There's components around that. Similarly, on the academic side, it's actually how do we increase our profile in the scientific community to really demonstrate the world-class science that we're already doing, and hopefully we'll continue to do. So there's probably is something in the corporate plan around how we present ourselves, and I don't think that's vague. I think that's fairly fundamental, actually, to be honest. And maybe that needs to be an explicit part of you know, how we put this together. It's not only what we do; it's also maybe how we present ourselves too, in a broader sense.
Summarised it very well. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Mercy, can I come to you, please?
Yeah, just 2 points. I like the one plan idea. It's easier to keep a handle on it, and I think we're going through this transition period, so just 2 points. One on review, so having regular review, so finding out, you know, are we delivering against it? Is it kind of working, and do we need to tweak it in whatever way? Because I think we need to be quite dynamic during this period. And the other is just...
Sorry, Miss, can I just ask you what your opinion is in terms of how we do that? Is that something you would see the board doing, or would you see an assurance committee doing?
I think it needs to come up through the board, but I think the assurance committees all have a role to play with that, especially around, obviously with the Patient and Safety Assurance Committee. I see it would be looking at that part of the plan, which is around, you know, cumulage and issues like that, but also how the new agency with its innovation incorporates that kind of patient safety profile all the way through it as well, and what those new kind of what it would look like as we go forward. So I think through the assurance committees, but definitely it's a board thing as well, and maybe our scorecard will help with some of that too.
Oh, well, that's a great link actually. So I will come back to the second point, but I do think there's an important component in this, is that I think that we need to, if we're going to review the delivery plan effectively in detail, I think we won't have time at a board meeting to do that full justice. So having, you know, the assurance committees delving into the respective areas that are relevant in more detail to make sure there's that good support and there's that good challenge. And then we can get an overview to the board to see the entire picture. Because things, as Mandy says, will change, and we need the ability to be able to flex. So I think we need both and is what I would say, because, you know, I don't think we've always had as much discipline on the delivery of a corporate plan as I think we actually need. We don't want something that's recorded historically. We want it to be real time, and it needs to be into a really strict operating rhythm. Will be my view. Sorry, I cut you off halfway through. I know you had a second point you wanted to make.
Well, I agree with that summary, Stephen. The other point was about public profile, and this is also about reputation, isn't it? Really. So it's a different profile for different audiences. Let me put it that way. So obviously, there's something about public and patients, and that assurance out there that we're doing a good job and that we're there for them if there are any issues they need to know to come to us, but also how the agency is changing post cumulage. So that's really important. But I think also, given our discussions about, you know, kind of the scientific excellence and innovation that we could really be kind of building on, I think reputation around that, which is there in pockets, because I know the agency internationally has good reputation. So we don't just want to, you know, kind of maintain that, but also we need to expand it as well. And so I think our discussions around publications and profile, and for ambassadors like the board to be promoting that as well, is really important.
That's great. Oh, thank you for that. Bruce, can I come to you, please?
Yes, perhaps it's a detail, but I'm a little concerned in section 5 under strategic priorities about the possible inadvertent jumbling up of medicines and devices. And forgive me if I'm going to be slightly outspoken about this, but medicines are not going to change hugely in the foreseeable future. Devices are facing huge change. They're facing everything said by cumulage. They're facing a completely, totally new system after we leave the European Union in terms of the way they're regulated, licensed, whatever. They are also facing the business, which I know is in preparation in the agency, of some huge new kind of database. Devices are facing huge change. And putting them in a sense together with medicines in these various sentences, other than perhaps surveillance, I just worry about the whole emphasis of that. And I'd also be almost heretical, and I say heretical in front of members of the public so they're clear about this, in talking about the profile of the MHRA, which I've always had concerns about. And at the moment, if you look at it, it says MHRA, and then it says CPRD, NIBSCI, and MHRA. What is that about? For goodness sake, what I would think would be much more easily understandable would be MHRA, it's medicines, medical devices, CPRD, and NIBSCI. And I would understand that, and I think the public would understand it better. And I'm sorry, I know that's going to be an unpopular thing to say, but I say it in this context.
I think the point's well made, actually, Bruce. I don't think we need to sort of try and get the solutions today. But June, do you want to pick up this, the comment around medicines and medical devices? And because I'm not sure I completely agree that medicines will stay exactly the same, actually, Bruce, to be fair. But June.
Well, first of all, can I say, Bruce, very much welcome your clear perspective on this. And I think it chimes with many of us that devices indeed are going to go through a period of overwhelming change, but to the good. This is not to be restrictive. The world is the oyster, the technology and the opportunities. We've heard already mention of some of the amazing developments in the device area. But perhaps I'm with Stephen, with Chair, that will actually have an amazingly useful backwash onto medicines, where the risk proportionality, the focus on rapid evolution in clinical practice are models that medicines can do with borrowing from devices, medical devices. I fully agree with you that the surveillance area is the very, very first to synergize and to then build on. No one wants to dilute the important specificity of the expertise that goes into the regulation of devices. But I do think there'll be a very valuable knock-on for the world of medicines, which also hasn't changed for a long time and probably is ripe for it, with the technology and the scientific development in medicines ever closer together. The time is now to do this.
But I think Bruce's point is still helpful, though. I think in the sense that in clarity, you know, Bruce, you and I share a view to have absolute clarity on what it is we're proposing, and I think actually that's actually quite a helpful point to make. Okay, I'm just conscious of time, but I am keen to try and just pop around the rest of the table. So, Greg, did you want to ask another question?
No, sorry, that was an old hand.
Oh, it's an old hand. Okay, not to worry. Okay, okay, no worries. That's nice to see you anyway. Anthony, do you want to have the last question on this topic?
Yeah, it's actually to feed into the strategic and business priorities that we were asked to. I fully support the regulatory science, but I also would like to make sure we see the ongoing data and technology strategy. I want to see that separated from this. The data part of that is key, and also the fees being brought into that, because that's going to be critical. I'd also, if possible, like to be very clear about our strategic priorities, what we're not investing in. We make some very clear active decisions about, there's a range of things we could do, but we have chosen not to focus on this in the next 2 years because we're focusing on this. So clarity regarding that, because I think sometimes that's the thing we miss, and then it distracts us as we're going forward.
Yeah, I think that last point is particularly valuable. We're very good at trying to change everything, and we just cannot physically do everything at once. I think we can do some parallel working, and we should absolutely do that, but we should be clear what the priorities are. So I suppose coming back around to you, John, I was sort of letting you just listen and take in all the conversation. Any reflections on what we do next in terms of the next steps for the corporate plan?
Thank you, Chair. No, I mean, we've had very clear feedback on the duration and also the themes. So I'll share that with the team. We'll follow the timeline we proposed with the, again, additional helpful steers of involving our devolved administration colleagues earlier rather than later. So we'll take it forward on the basis of this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I think what we can then do is just is come down, and it might be we need 5 strategic priorities rather than 4. But you know, whatever it is, let's try and make sure that this is all encompassing. Let's make sure it's prioritised and makes the choices of what we are going to do and what we're not going to do. Coming back to Anthony's point at the end there, so I think that we welcome the work, and there's a real opportunity here to drive the performance and the future of the agency in the brave new world after the 1st of January 2021. So let's take the opportunity. That's what I would say. Okay, that being the case, if we can move on to the next paper, which is actually on page 43. Hopefully this is not going to be a long debate because I've actually spoken to everybody about this already. But one of the actions was to propose the membership of the board assurance committees. And so I'm just really looking for approval. Michael, is that an old hand or is that a new hand?
No, it's an old hand. My apologies.
That's okay. Just checking that you weren't disagreeing that I'd had the conversation with you. But yeah, so there's 2 components. There's the proposed assurance committee membership. We've got the 3 assurance committees which we approved in concept at the last board meeting. The proposed members for Audit and Risk Assurance Committee are listed in the paper, the members for the Patient and Safety Assurance Committee, and then the members for the Organisational Development and Remuneration Committee. like our board, I'm very keen that we have a unitary board committee membership with representation from both executives and non-executives, but with a non-executive chair. Hopefully the non-executive chair will not need to use a casting vote, but I think as a matter of principle, that's just an important piece of good governance. So can I ask if there are anyone who would disagree with that? Bruce.
Simply a question. There is some urgency to all of this, and I note that both the lay members are to be recruited, and the typical recruitment processes which I've seen for such committees can take a very long time, and also recruiting and training and helping lay members, I mean, I've chaired committees for years with lay members on them, can be quite a business. Yeah. And I just wondered what the agency had in mind for the short term and for the longer term in terms of recruitment and getting people who are going to be most useful on those committees.
Yeah, I think, well, Mercy and I had a conversation around wanting to go through a recruitment process to recruit new lay members, because I think actually it's an opportunity to bring some new blood and some new thinking from other expert committees. But I don't know, Mercy, whether you've got any immediate reaction to Bruce's question?
Just to actually agree with him, we have to be quick on this, but I would like an open and transparent process. But if we can move quite quickly, that would be quite good to set up the committee as soon as possible. I know we still need to agree final terms and conditions of this, and so I think a kind of a relatively speedy convening of the committee as it stands, even if it's in its shadow form, would be quite good to actually discuss things like this, Bruce, and to make sure that we have an open and transparent process.
You see, I would suggest that the board committee should actually start. I think the question will be is whether we want to second some lay members on pending a full recruitment, because that would enable you to proceed. You know, and that might be just a practical way forward, just to get the operational committee up and running. That's what I'm probably most keen to achieve.
And we have precedent for that, because I know that before I was recruited to the board, you did have kind of lay members sitting on the board as well. So I know that. So
that might be a practical solution, just to enable it to start quickly, but still go through a full and proper recruitment process to bring some new blood into the organisation from a lay perspective.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Okay.
That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Thank you.
Michael, is that an old hand or is that a new hand?
So it's an old hand. I've got one comment later on the board date, Stephen, but not on the
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so can I ask for the board's approval for this committee membership? I'm seeing lots of nods. Thumbs up, right, okay. So we can say that is approved. The other part of the paper also then just included some areas of special responsibilities. These are not necessarily meant to be the only responsibilities the non-executives have, but I think we've got a lot of breadth of experience around this board table, and I'm really keen that non-executives have got the opportunity to share that and to contribute to you know, the development of the agency. So these were some of, if you like, the more formal you know, mechanisms where people were either members or chairs of specific committees that have been set up. This list will continue to evolve and should continue to evolve as and when there's a need for additional non-executive input. But it does not take away as well, I hope, that non-executives also feel able to contribute outside of meetings and outside of formal responsibilities to continue to support and constructively challenge the executives in terms of some of the plans of the way forward. So that was meant to be just a list of the special responsibilities as they exist today. So, Mercy?
Yeah, I just, as there are a number of staff that are listening in, just raising the point that I'm the raising a concern champion and things, so that staff kind of know.
As of this second, in fact. So, exactly. And I think I'll connect you with Kirsten and the policy team to enable some more widespread communication through the agency on that, Mercy. That will be my plan. So, okay. So that was the, so I assume that board responsibilities are also okay. No one's got any violent disagreements. Anthony?
It's not a disagreement. sorry, it's not a disagreement, but I just think given the importance of the science strategy, that we either asked Dave could look at it directly.
So I missed that. Was that asking if David could get involved in the regulatory science strategy?
Yeah, if not, somebody needs to point into that, and I think it's important they're pointed early on. So I just leave it with you to sort out. But I just think,
yeah, David's got a thumbs up, so I think that will be a sweet spot that David would be very keen to get involved in. Knowing him reasonably well. Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, and then just moving on to the final paper, which was then just around some board dates. So proposed board dates. Michael, you said you had it.
Yeah, it's only really, I should say this in the interest of John Fundray and Boriana and the finance team, and I'm sure it's okay, but the board has to approve the annual financial statements, and we normally did that the third week in June, and we brought it forward a week. I just want to check with John that that's doable, because I don't think you can let it go to the 20th of July because you're very close to parliamentary recess. As long as John and Boriana, or we'd have to have some separate arrangements, Stephen, but I don't know what John Fundray's view on that is.
I think we should be able to hit that, Michael. If not, previously, I think we've had a general board discussion and then delegated the final approval to the ARAC committee. So I'm sure we can make that work.
And I think that would be quite a sensible way forward, John, to be honest, anyway, because I think June does rely very much on ARAC from a signing off of the accounts as the accounting officer. So I think there'd almost certainly need to be an ARAC discussion on top of that. Okay. What I was trying to do with the board dates was just try and get into a regular rhythm, and so I picked a Tuesday and the third Tuesday in the month to avoid NHS meetings that some of us are also involved in. So that was the principle behind it. Just have a routine rhythm, so we know the third Tuesday of every month is likely to be an MHRA board day. The other important thing for members of the public is that the intention is that all of these board meetings will be held in public. So that actually is a change. So again, which I think is an important one in terms of our transparency and openness agenda too. So can I assume then we have board agreement that we'll use these as the working dates for next year and that we can publish them? No one's disagreeing, so we'll take those as read. Natalie, over to you to ensure that to implement those. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the formal papers. I think, as promised, I said that we would hold a question and answer session so that members of the public could ask some questions. I'm sorry that we haven't had time to do that until now, but I think it's been really quite an interesting and extensive discussion. So I wanted to make sure that we could finish those papers off and do justice to them. Now is a good time to start thinking about questions from the public. So Rachel, could I ask you to just ask the first question on behalf of one of the members of the public, please?
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. And we've got both some questions that were pre-submitted and a couple of questions that have come through on Slido. And I know we also have one member of the public who's going to ask their question in person. So I thought we would start with a group of questions on vaccines. So the first one is asking for an explanation of the difference in the UK's process of approving the COVID-19 vaccine as compared to the UK process as compared to the EU process, and any implications for safety and security of the rollout.
So, June, do you want to pick that one up, please?
Thank you. It's a very good question because at this moment, as part of the EU, the full authorisation the candidate vaccines would be as part of the European Medicines Agency process, and then it would automatically be valid in the UK. However, as part of EU law, a member state can use provisions that enable a temporary authorisation of supply to meet an emergency situation based on public health need. But the key point in answering the question is that the same high standards of quality, of safety, of effectiveness would apply. And I think that's the take home. The legal basis or framework may adapt to the emergency, but the same standards of effectiveness, of safety, of quality would apply. So I hope that answers both sides of the question, both on the, if you like, the framework and process, but also on whether or not there are implications for safety.
Thank you for that. Okay, well, I'm also pleased to say that we're joined, because I can see her picture, we've got Justina Ostrowska has actually joined us online. Justina, I understand you're an associate at the Taylor Wessing law firm. Thank you for giving us your consent to appear on video today. And just wondered if you wanted to ask your question directly to the board.
Yes, thank you very much. And I have to say it's been an interesting meeting. I've been really enjoyed listening to it, not just in my capacity professionally, but also as a member of the public as well. Okay. My question almost has been answered by June already, but I think the second part of it maybe would be really good to hear the answer to. So in relation to these standards you will use for assessment of the Pfizer and other COVID vaccines, do you intend to share or coordinate this review with the European Medicines Agency?
June, do you want to answer that?
Well, thank you, Chair. And just as we're meeting today, colleagues might want to be aware that we have, I believe, Rachel, put out a press release this morning about the stage we're at. And it's really, if you like, an emblem or a symbol of the openness that we wish to pursue. We're pleased to have received the further data from Pfizer-BioNTech on the COVID-19 vaccine candidate, and we're rigorously addressing the data in the way that I outlined just before. And that builds on a rolling review, the staged review as data have become available, that started quite some time ago. So I think in terms of your question, it really goes to international collaboration. And I'm pleased to say that as a very active member of the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, we do liaise very frequently and very intensively with EMA and with other regulators right around the world, in particular FDA and the Access Consortium, which is Australia, Canada, Switzerland and Singapore. So we are committed to being very open and to sharing our assessments, while always, if you like, taking our decisions in the context of the public health need in the emergency situation here in the UK. So I hope that helps build a picture for our, if you like, transparency and our commitment to collaboration.
Justina, as you made the effort to send a pre-submitted question and also gave your consent to appear on video, you've got the opportunity to have a right of reply. Does that answer the question?
No, it does, but if I get more airtime, can I also ask a sort of,
yes, you can.
Just to clarifying question in terms of the criteria that you will be using? Well, sort of, should I take it as read that even though you'll be using this term temporary authorization procedure, you will otherwise be applying the sort of the regulation 726 2004 to the assessment of the vaccine?
Well, we clearly have highlighted our role internationally, and we've been abreast of and involved in the development of the WHO guidelines, the EMA guidelines, and so that's the kind of international standards that we'll be applying. And I think really that's, you know, comes from that involvement we've had as the nature of the vaccines and the technology have become clear, that we've been closely involved in developing these. So I hope that gives you kind of a flavour of the direction we're going in.
Okay, Justina, well, thank you very much for asking the question. I hope that that helps.
Yep,
I think what's really important here is that the MHRA is actively involved with other international regulators. I think that was the key point that's been made. We understand the urgency and the importance, and for those people that were not at the last board meeting, we did take a paper at the last board meeting to gain assurance that the agency had sufficient resources to be able to handle multiple applications of the COVID vaccine at the same time. You know, and that involves parallel working, flexible rolling reviews to ensure that we can actually assess these vaccines, you know, to make sure that very robustly achieve the safety, the quality, and the efficacy components that are absolutely required. So we're working independently and robustly through that particular process. So back to questions. Rachel, was there another question around vaccines you wanted to ask?
Thanks, Chair. There's a couple more questions on vaccines. The first one is about the long-term safety of coronavirus vaccine, and particularly whether the new vaccines that are being developed will be safe in the long term for pregnant women and their babies?
Oh, it's a very important question. June, any thought?
Important, and colleagues will realise that the standard we'll be looking at is, because the trials are, if you like, not long in their duration, at least a good proportion of safety information at 2 months. So knowing that for many vaccines we get a good handle on the safety profile at 6 weeks, we will be using the 2-month measure. But in the longer term, this will rely on follow-up and the various mechanisms we have in place to collect long-term follow-up data and to conduct appropriate studies. From the trials, we will only know about perhaps 1 in 3,500 as a rate of an adverse, suspected adverse reaction, whereas we'll want to know about the much rarer possible adverse reactions. So that will be a matter of the longer term surveillance that we'll undertake. Part of the question was about pregnancy, and you'll be aware that pregnant women haven't been included in trials, although clearly with the extensive nature of those trials, there are a small number of pregnancies that will have been recorded and will be carefully followed up. So we expect, and this is a matter of consideration by our expert advisory committees, that pregnant women won't be included as a recommended population. And if we're looking at, for example, healthcare workers, so if the government is going to recommend that we would recommend that healthcare workers only have the vaccine after they've given birth. But really to say this is all looking ahead, we're in the process of conducting these rigorous reviews, and I'm just giving you just now a direction of travel rather than a final position.
Okay, I think that's very helpful, June. Thank you for that. Rachel, next question.
Thanks. And last but not least, this question follows on from Sam's paper on enforcement, and it's talking about potential vaccine fraud and whether the MHRA will be proactive and raising awareness of this to the general public sooner rather than later, and whether we see that that's an issue.
Okay, Sam, could you follow that one up?
Yeah, of course, thank you. So, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we're certainly working with other law enforcement partners across the system to understand the nature and extent of the likely threat from crime related to the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines. What we need to do really is develop that sort of robust understanding that can then ensure that we have a robust response. This will need to be coordinated across the system because we're not in isolation, we're not operating alone, of course, in this. So it may be that at that point we'll then look at proactive awareness raising in respect to this. So I think it's part of a sort of bigger piece of work that needs to fall out, and there may be other messaging as well, not just on the risk around this.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. Rachel?
Okay, thank you. So moving away from vaccines, there was also another follow-up on Sam's paper, which perhaps we could take now, which was whether there's any data on why people in the UK resort to obtaining medicines illegally, as you highlighted in your paper.
Now that's a complex question. Sam?
Thank you. Great question. And of course, there are probably data somewhere around. I haven't got them to hand, but what I can say is that it's a very complex picture. We talked about that earlier. We understand that motivations for accessing medicines from illegal sources vary considerably. Some are because there's perhaps people are unable to or unwilling to access medicines through the normal routes and normal healthcare practitioners, for example. Others may indeed be purchasing for recreational purposes or as substances of abuse. So there's a really wide variety of reasons why they do access it in this way. I would just point out actually this does really lend itself to what I was saying earlier about it being quite a movable feast, a very complex picture. And if I may, Chair, just go back to Mercy's question, which was around the triangle, having looked at that paragraph again. what we're talking about here is that the criminality is also very movable. So where our activities are very positive, it pushes people from having very complex, serious crimes down to more less serious, and vice versa. We actually see that other criminals actually move and don't just stay static in terms of the area in which they operate. So I think if you look at the two elements, both from the members of the public being quite movable in terms of why they do certain things, and also how the criminals operate, it does lead to a very, very difficult position. But we have a very well, an excellent team in place really to look at both of these areas, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, so I think there are multiple motivations, I think is what you're saying, and unfortunately there are multiple actors involved in the process of trying to deliver this, so it is highly complex. But okay, thank you for that, and thanks for going back to Mercy's point as well. Okay, Rachel, any more questions?
Yeah, there's just one final question, which was one of the pre-submitted ones, and that was about medicine error and incident reporting and learning using the National Medication Safety Network. And the questioner has asked, will this be used to promote safer prescribing? Will it include reporting for long-term therapy and polytherapy? And where should someone go if they want to learn more about the National Medication Safety Network?
Okay, so I think there were probably multiple questions there, if I hear you right. June, can we maybe pick them off one at a time, and in terms of you know, what's been the sort of the medicine error and incident reporting and learning using the National Medication Safety Network? I suppose that was the first point.
Yes, and can I just say before we go into the detail, what a really helpful focus this brings to us. And particularly having discussed our corporate plan and the areas we'll be looking at to the future. And it may well be that we'll want to come back to the board with something a little bit more in depth, because our questioner has put their spotlight on an important area. The National Medication Safety Network's been up and running for 6 years now with NHS England and Improvement, and it really has brought together quite a lot of colleagues, which is the key way to be embedded with the NHS, which is charged with managing risk. So it's a very active network. It shares learning right across the UK, involving devolved administrations, and it helps to implement and look at the, if you like, the feasibility of all the alerts that we put out. So I think it's, perhaps we could say, a pillar of our risk management system. And I think if that doesn't fully answer all the questions in our colleagues' mind, we can probably provide more on paper, because there's a good story to tell here about this very lively network. It's possible our colleagues from the devolved administrations might want to come in too. So if I stop there and then perhaps move to the next question.
Sorry, June, can I just slightly push back and say on the learning, who's been learning? So is this healthcare professionals or other people involved?
It's a two-way, I would say. It's both for the health service to be appraised of risks and risk management, and then supported by regular dialogue. And I believe there are monthly teleconferences and so on. That learning is gathered, and that's absolutely the kind of relationship with the NHS this network is meant to evolve. I've been involved in one or two of the annual conferences, and they're absolutely, emblematic of a two-way dialogue, not a dissemination of information. And if you like, that's the key to our future responsive safety systems that we want to see in place. And I think clearly more to do if it supports safe prescribing. Clearly we're in a world now, and I think our questioner is well aware of one of the cumberledge issues, where when we actually understand that prescribing could be made more safe, more driving down the risks, then actually we need to do more as a regulator and go further. And I suspect our questioner may have a particular area in mind around that. But actually, if it was a really, if you like, 100% effective network, we would actually have absolutely optimal prescribing. And we know that in some safety areas, prescribing is variable across the country. And sodium valproate is one of those. So I suspect that might be behind that thinking. Shall I pause there for a moment?
Yeah, I was just wondering about, you know, the next component then is about how will it impact on long-term therapy and polytherapy. So, because that's the safe prescribing is one component, but then it's also the long-term impact of these drugs.
Yes. There may well be areas that and I think in the area of valproate, find are weaker, because when someone is on long-term medication, they may well be maintained with repeat prescriptions for quite some time. And therefore, when we're seeking to change prescribing and change behaviour, our tools have to adapt. And this is where partnership working with other bodies involved right across the UK is critically important. So again, I think possibly sodium valproate might have precipitated some of this thinking. And I do think that there are areas where we can actually help drive up best practice in relation to long-term therapy and the changes that need to be introduced.
Okay, that's great. So Rachel, I think there's probably an opportunity here to go back to the questionnaire offline. Can I leave that in your team's capable hands?
Yes,
just to make sure that the questions about where to go to learn more about the network and those sort of components are, and that we've fully answered the question, because it was a very detailed question, and I think it deserves a fully detailed answer.
Yes, certainly. We'll pick that up afterwards.
Okay. And were there any more questions?
No, that's the last question that's been submitted, Chair.
Okay, right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone on the panel on the screen today for your contribution. Particularly thank you to everyone who's written and presented papers. You know, I think it shows the breadth of the agency. You know, we started off with June's report on, you know, setting the current context, and there's a wide range of activities that were involved in there. We've talked about the science base, and, you know, it's the real sort of beating heart of the agency when it comes to you know, the scientific research program. And I think we've got a real opportunity to create something very special with a Centre for Regulatory Science. I think that's certainly something that we talked about there. Patient safety has many guises, and we've talked today specifically around enforcement. But, you know, we know that you know, as we talked about in the questions on COVID vigilance as well, yeah, safety has to permeate through the entire fabric of this agency. That's our raison d'etre, to protect and improve patient health. That's absolutely the reason that we're here. I think it was helpful to shine a spotlight on the enforcement activities, but we do, you know, many other patient safety vigilance activities too. We talked about risk. You know, the agency is facing a number of, you know, existential problems and challenges, but we're also, you know, we're addressing them. You know, we're not hiding away from them. We're addressing them and taking them on, you know, one by one. So hence, managing the risks and the mitigations is critically important. And we gained assurance from Michael's paper on that. And then finally, we started to talk about some of the priorities for the strategic plan, you know, the single corporate plan for the next 2 years. That's how we're going to continue to deliver impact, not just within the UK, with our devolved administrations, with the Department of Health and Social Care, and then with other international regulators and stakeholders around the world. So I think this agency is in a really good place. We've got an opportunity to make a massive difference. And I just want to thank everyone for your continued support and look forward to making many of these things a reality. So thank you very much, everybody. We'll call that a day for today. The meeting's now closed, and we'll see you all again in January. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.